Hello and welcome to Magical Mystery Tour, Stories by James Blaylock. I am your moderator, Erica Zemanek. I'm a faculty here at Saddleback. I want to thank our sponsors, Saddleback College Foundation and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. All right. James P. Blaylock is a Southern California writer whose short stories, novels, and collections have been published around the world. Along with Tim Powers and K.W. Jeter, he is one of the literary pioneers of the steampunk movement. His novel, Homunculus, won the Philip K. Dick Memorial Award in 1985. His short story, Paper Dragons, won the World Fantasy Award in 1986, 13 Phantasms in 1997, and his story, Unidentified Objects, was nominated for an O. Henry Award in 1990. Despite his close association with steampunk, most of his work is contemporary, realistic fantasy set in Southern California, typified by books like The Last Coin, The Digging Leviathan, The Rainy Season, Winter Tides, All the Bells on Earth, and Knights of the Cornerstone, and the young adult novel, Zeuglodon, The True Adventures of Kathleen Perkins, cryptozoologist. His novel, The Rainy Season, was selected by Orange Coast Magazine as one of the quintessential Orange County novels. In all, he has published 35 novels and short collections, and numerous articles and essays. Recent novels include Pennies from Heaven and The Invisible Woman, mystery crime novels set in Old Town Orange. According to the Library Journal, Blaylock's evocative prose and studied pacing make him one of the most distinctive contributors to American realism. Mr. Blaylock has taught college and university writing and literature classes for 47 years, having taught at Chapman University for 33 years, now Professor Emeritus. In the year 2000, he developed the Creative Writing Conservatory at the Orange County School of the Arts, which he directed for 13 years, and which led to his winning of the U.S. Presidential Scholars Program 2012 Teacher Recognition Award. Please welcome James P. Blaylock with me.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming. I don't know what I can add to that. I think maybe I'm done. Just kidding. I put a couple of books up here on the table, including my most recent, if you want to look at them after the chat, and also a couple of books set in downtown Orange and its environs that I wrote back in a number of years ago. I've written lots of things about downtown Orange. My wife, Vicki, and I, she's sitting right there in red, moved to downtown Orange 50 years ago, maybe a little over 50 years ago, and we've lived there ever since. And I find it to be a sort of a magical place, very charming. People say that about us, very charming. I think it's sort of charmed in a more objective way, in that it's got a certain amount of mystery in it. It's a lot of fun to write about it. And so the Orange, that's full of mystery and crime and spontaneous human combustion and things like that, that you find in these books, probably isn't what you'll find if you drive down there tonight and look around. You might, I'm not quite sure, but there we go. So this chat has something to do with turning authentic places into settings for books that have a certain fabulous quality to them. A lot of my books, the fantasy has to do with ghosts. I guess elements of the books probably qualify as horror, although I don't know how horrifying they actually are. That said, I'm going to read a piece from the beginning of a book that was published a couple of years back called Pennies from Heaven. And then a little piece from its companion book, its sequel, which is titled The Invisible Woman. And if you have can consider those titles for a moment, you'll notice that my titles are not entirely the most original part of my writing. In fact, I'm real fond at stealing titles, as long as I won't be sued. My third novel, which was a thing called The Digging Leviathan, when I submitted it to Ace Books, it was titled Journey to the Center of the Earth. And I got a phone call from my editor that was pretty funny, in which she explained to me certain things about titles. And anyway, this is from Pennies from Heaven, which, as I say, is set in downtown Orange. Jane Larkin rested against piled-up pillows, working in the glow of her tiny bedside lamp. She was adding the budget numbers in a spiral notebook for the second time and not much liking what she saw. The clock read 4 in the morning, but she knew that she was through sleeping, just like she knew there was nothing wrong with her arithmetic. She listened to the sound of October rain gurgling out of the downpipe into the flower beds, and now and then a gust of wind drove raindrops against the window panes. Summer had abruptly turned into fall at the end of August this year, and there had been an unending succession of cool days and cooler nights throughout September, with unseasonable rain 2 or 3 times a week, often heavy. She wished that a fire was burning in the bedroom fireplace, one of the nicely quaint elements of the old Spanish-style house that she and Jerry had bought 6 months ago in Old Orange, the downtown historical district of the city of Orange. A year ago, Jane had been awarded a MacArthur Foundation grant and had found herself director of a project she had named the Old Orange Co-op. She had been happily shocked to receive the funding she had asked for, enough to pay limited salaries and expenses for 3 years, by which time the co-op was intended to be self-perpetuating. That would be possible only with the help from the city and elusive private money. The months, however, were flying fast, and the perpetual rain was literally drowning the co-op's activities. Jerry breathed evenly on the opposite side of the bed, half out of the covers. His legs stippled with the glow of the street lamp slanting through the blinds. She discovered when they were married that sleeping was one of Jerry's talents. His black hair was bed-raggled, as Jane's mother used to say, and his face wore a serene expression. He was tall enough to take up the length of the mattress, and even in sleep his muscles were clearly defined, which came from years of swimming and surfing. Jane envied his ability to eat anything and not gain weight. She thought about waking him up, accidentally on purpose, so that she had someone to talk numbers with. He was good at convincing her not to worry. The melody from Pennies from Heaven came into her mind, along with the memory of her father singing it to her when she was a little girl, afraid of thunder. She had loved the idea of carrying an umbrella upside down when it rained in order to catch heavenly pennies. She would have hummed the tune, but not at this ungodly hour of the morning. Pennies weren't going to cut it anyway. Their dog Pee-wee, a cross between a Shih Tzu and a pug and maybe a French bulldog, lay on his back between them, snoring, resting against Jerry's side, his feet pointing toward the ceiling. Pee-wee's face was perfectly flat, a moon-like two-dimensional face that made him appear self-satisfied and contributed to a noisy night's sleep. Jerry shifted, rolling slightly closer to the edge of the bed, and Pee-wee did the same, crowding up against him as if shrinking Jerry's available space in a bold effort to tip him off onto the floor. Jane set her notebook aside and picked up the collection of ghost stories she'd been reading in bed last night. She had put it down when it became particularly nightmarish, but it would probably be safe now that her mind had no interest in sleep. She had started to read when Pee-wee abruptly woke up, stared wide-eyed at Jane for a frozen moment, and then heaved himself to his feet, jumped to the floor, and ran out through the doorway. Someone on the porch, Jane thought, but now she saw that the ceiling lamp was swaying on its chains, part of her mind associated with Pee-wee's hitting the floor. But the ground gave a lurch, and the entire house shook and bounced on its foundation, the blinds clacking against the window frame, and a cloud of black soot whooshing out of the fireplace. She heard a rumbling sound, or perhaps imagined it, and she pushed Jerry's shoulder hard, shouting his name as she clambered out of bed. Awaking instantly, Jerry followed her into the doorway, where they jammed themselves in, holding on as the shaking increased. And that's that. That constitutes a piece of the first chapter of the book. And I'll say right now that the earthquake is plays a big part in what happens in the book, although the earthquake is not the problem of the book. It's very difficult to write a book in which the problem of the book has to do with earthquakes, because there's really not anything the characters can do about it except jump into the doorway. But it sort of kicks things off with a bang. Here's a piece from early in my book, The Invisible Woman, which, by the way, is a sequel to the first book. If anybody has any idea of reading the books, you have to read Pennies from Heaven first. If you look at The Invisible Woman and read anything about it, it'll simply spoil the thrill of, the sequel. I hope there's a thrill. So here's a bit from The Invisible Woman. The Square Mile Historic District of Old Orange is a hodgepodge of century-old neighborhoods with tree-shaded craftsman bungalows, Victorian and Spanish Revival homes, with here and there a 1940s ranch-style house with steel frame windows and broad eave overhangs. A circular plaza, called the Plaza by longtime residents, and the Circle by newcomers, is with its tiled fountain, pie-sliced plots of grass, rose gardens, old sycamore and pine trees and green painted benches, sits in the center of the downtown. Chapman Avenue bisects Old Orange, stretching away east and west, and Glassell Street does the same north and south. Car traffic slowed by people in crosswalks, heading toward antique stores, cafes, bars, clothing boutiques, and garden shops. A timeless place in the immense suburban sprawl of Southern California. Jane and Jerry sat out front of Scotty's drugstore and stowed a fountain at the east end of the Plaza District on a perfect Southern California morning, their table adjacent to the sidewalk along Chapman Avenue. Pee-wee sat on his travel pillow next to Jerry's leg, either asleep or meditating. It was 7 a.m. The sun had just risen from behind the Santa Ana Mountains, the eastern sky orange-red and dark blue. Overhead lights glowed on the underside of the wide canvas awning that sheltered the sidewalk. The cafe was already busy with early birds, and the air drifting out through the open doors was full of the smell of coffee and bacon and pancakes on a hot griddle. Jane had ordered bacon and pancakes. Jerry's combo plate had the same, but with 2 fried eggs over easy, which required a side order of toast. Across from them on a window table sat 6 men in their 70s who wore garish aloha shirts, a group of Saturday morning regulars who had graduated from Orange High School back in the 1960s and had never found a reason to move away. In Jane and Jerry's 4 years of living downtown, Jane had discovered that people tended to stay in Old Orange once they settled in. Where better? One of the men tipped his straw hat at Jane, and she nodded and smiled back. It was spring, and spring made her happy. All was right with the world, or at least with Old Orange, and the future looked bright in the morning sunshine. That is not the first chapter of the book. There's a chapter that precedes it that has some dark qualities to it, I'm going to say, that the characters don't understand at this point, and the reader won't understand at this point, but they're going to find out as the book goes along. I could have put this in as the first chapter because it's got a lot of setting details at the beginning, and everything seems to be pleasant at this point. But that seemed to me to be the problem with it. I'd rather start out at something that intimates that, I don't know, there's actually going to be a plot. So I saved this sort of nice stuff to kind of acclimate the reader to the sort of place that this was taking place in. That's not a good sentence, but I guess it works. In this, I'm just going to point out a couple of things. First, it's, I think, a fairly accurate description of Old Town Orange, which I didn't call Old Town Orange. I went round and round with that. I finally decided to call it Old Orange partly because I didn't want to put an E on the end of Old Town all the time. I woke up one morning about 2 and thought I should call it Ye Old Town and put an E on the end of everything. But I thought, no, that's maybe too over the top. Everything in there is accurate, I suppose, to a degree. If you're familiar with Old Town, some readers who are particularly familiar with Old Town will figure out that that they're sitting outside of Scotty's drugstore, and that's actually Watson's drugstore, and which was owned by a guy named Scotty Parker, who was a heck of a nice guy and became a friend of ours over the years. Watson's was swept away and turned into a bad restaurant, which was followed by a worse restaurant, and now there's a third vying for the title, I guess. And I believe I have this bad attitude because I really, really liked Watson's drugstore, and I saw it as being sort of the heart of the downtown. I say that it's at the east end of the Plaza District. I put that in just because I wanted to invent a few things, but nobody, I think, refers to different sections of downtown Orange as this or that district. And I point that out because not everything in here is supposed to be true. I'm making this up. And I changed the name of stores and restaurants, whatever it might happen to be. Not randomly, but because I have a certain cheerful memory of those places, and I want them to be a cheerful part of my book. And so and some of the names of places in here actually have been out of date for a long, long time. The characters eat regularly at the snack shop, and the snack shop is now Woody's on Chapman Avenue, and the snack shop disappeared and became a Coco's, I don't know when, probably back in the early 1980s, maybe at the end of the 1970s. But I still remember the snack shop. It was a very cool place. My characters stop at one point in a store called McFrugal's. I love that name. It turns out, when I looked into it, that that Pick and Save, which became Big Lots, was originally called McFrugal's. And then they changed it to Pick and Save, which is on Grand Street right outside Old Town. And I so much liked McFrugal's better than Pick and Save, or, that I thought, heck, I'm going to call it McFrugal's. It says here that the sun had just risen from behind the Santa Ana Mountains. Some wise person might raise their hand and say, you know what, if you're sitting in front of Watson's drugstore, you can't see Saddleback. But in this book, you can. And that's about all there is to it. At the very end, I have, it was spring and spring made her happy. All was right with the world, or at least with Old Orange. And about 10 minutes from now, that's not going to be true anymore. So I thought I'd just throw that in as a kind of a laugh. I'll just say a couple of other things while I'm at it, before we start taking questions. At lunch, in fact, we're talking about Strunk and White, Strunk and White's book, The Elements of Style, is just absolutely one of the best books about writing. It's about that thick, and you can get it for $1 at any garage sale you walk into because everybody has a copy of it. And in that, E.B. White points out that authors disagree about just about everything. They get in fist fights over semicolons. But he said all authors would agree that a writer must put into their work the details that matter. And that just sounds dead obvious, until you start thinking about it, because it implies that there are some details that do not matter. And you want to leave those out. The details that matter, that has everything to do with the book that you're writing. If you're writing genre fiction, fantasy, horror, science fiction, probably those books require a great lot of setting details that you could leave out of a minimalist novel set in Bakersfield or something like that, you know. The particular quality of the details that you put in have to provide something besides verisimilitude. We hear that a writer needs verisimilitude, but I have to say that mere verisimilitude can be a bore if it's not functioning in the novel or in the story somehow. It's not enough just to get the details right. And in fact, on an absolute level, the details don't have to be gotten right, as long as things remain plausible. Other writers would argue that they have their own way of seeing things, and that's true. And in fact, your own writing should have everything to do with how you see things. I remember Philip K. Dick said that every single human being on Earth lived in their own private universe. And I think that that's true. And that's how come my novel reads differently than your novel does. I find that if I were to chase other people's way of seeing things, as I did when I was younger, that I could never write anything that was much good at all. I had to put in the details that painted a picture of the place from my point of view. And I'm going to say that the purpose for me of setting details in my novel has everything to do with producing an effect, and that's it. They have to be plausible or the whole thing falls over. But I put the details in to create an effect, which means that the variety of details that I put in changes as the book goes along, and depending upon the scene, basically. I want all of it, however, to produce an effect. Edgar Allan Poe wrote an interesting essay about that, about creating effect in poetry, which he did like a king. Probably if you read Poe, effect is what you read it for. And I've always thought that that was vital to my writing. Whether it's vital to somebody else's writing, I don't know. But there we have it. Maybe I'll just quit mouthing off and turn this over to our moderator.
All right, so we are going to open the Q&A. So I will start. I've got a question, and then we will open it up to the audience. I'm going to remind you now, and I'll remind you in a second, but please wait until Megan comes and brings the microphone to you. So, but I'll start off with a question. Obviously, Orange County, our area, is so important to your stories. Has setting always been important in your writing, or is that something, was there a change that you kind of realized, this is how I want to set my stories, setting is vital, and yeah?
That's a really good question, and I have to say that it's always been vital. And because I wrote my first story when I was 10 years old or something like that, I didn't know vital from anything. Mm-hmm. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd been, at the time, reading Mark Twain and John Steinbeck, which is a little bit weird for a 10-year-old. And quite frankly, I read the short stories in The Long Valley. I had no idea on earth about what some of it meant. I read Indubious Battle, which I liked because it had a character named Jim in it who was a communist who gets his head blown off at the end of the story. That was an eye-opener for a 10-year-old, I think it's the first time I ever heard anything about the international workers of the world, or things like that. But the thing I liked about Steinbeck, absolutely, to get to the point, is that Steinbeck always creates this gigantic effect. You read his descriptions of the Central California, and I don't know, they blew my mind, even as a kid. And it's impossible for me to say whether I came to write like I write because I was so heavily influenced by Steinbeck and Conan Doyle and Mark Twain, who all created great effects, or whether I was simply built to be that kind of writer. Was I turned into that kind of writer? Or was I built to be that kind of writer? I don't know. But that's how it turned out. So it was always there, even when I didn't have the language to express what I thought I was doing.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, we will go ahead and open up to questions. The mic should be working.
How do you manage your number of characters? Lately, I'm reading novels with so many characters that it's, I mean, you need a spreadsheet to get through it.
Yeah. That's another good question. It's the more characters you have, the more difficult it is to keep them all in play. And it's obviously if the mailman comes up onto the porch to deliver a piece of mail, the mail person, I should say, doesn't have to be a character per se. But once you get past 4 or 5 or 6 principal characters and you have subplots running for those characters and all, they all have to remain moving. And at least there has to be the illusion that they're off about their business while they're not on stage, But giving enough stage time to all those characters is really difficult. I myself I find it a little bit tedious sometimes when 8 or 10 characters are named in the first chapter or first couple of chapters, because I'll think, is it necessary right now for me to remember these names? Maybe I could have at one time in my life, but not anymore. Sometimes you catch up to it later and you think, okay, I'm in the groove now. But it's very difficult to you create real difficulties for yourself as a writer if you overload the book with characters, or a short story with characters. The other thing I'll say is that if I find myself doing that, I'll actually see if I can find characters that can be combined. Here's a character that I put in the story because they've got to, put the bomb in the bank vault or something like that. And I think, well, I got Bob right over here. He's got nothing to do right now. Why don't I just have him put the bomb in the bank vault and forget about this other character? So I'll routinely keep the cast small. Also, in the few books that I've written that have had a very large cast, the books tend to be big books because it takes a long time to tell everybody's story. And sometimes, Anyway, it's one of the difficult technical problems, I think, of writing books. Is figuring out how many to put in and why do you need that many and et cetera, yeah.
When you're writing about real places or real organizations like Orange County Sheriff Department or the Kaleidoscope in Mission Viejo, and you're critical or bad things happen there, do you need to be careful about naming real places? Do you need to change the names? Do you have to worry about getting sued later or whatever?
I'm not sure my books have ever had anything in there that was worth a lawsuit, but yes, it is a little bit peculiar. I knew in writing one recent book, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's one of the 2 recent books, that I wanted a librarian to have a shady past. And so I didn't want to just pick and choose and say that it was somebody who works at the main library on Chapman Avenue so that they could all worry about whether it was them, because my character just wasn't, I couldn't have that. That character runs something that I refer to as the Antiquities Center in Old Orange. And it turns out that back in the day, before the main library was torn down and rebuilt twice the size, that the reference library and the historical center and the rare books and stuff like that were in a 2-story craftsman bungalow in the parking lot next to the library. And it's a very, very cool building with parquet floor. And I used to go in there just to look around because it was such a, I also had a good friend who was a reference librarian there. So I had an excuse to linger. When they built the new library, they actually moved that to the corner of Lemon Street and Almond. Yeah. now it's a gorgeous house that somebody bought and they're living in it. I don't even know if the people who live there know that it used to be the reference library and they trotted it down the street, you know. Some fairly nefarious stuff goes on in that building. And so I didn't go into detail about where it came from. I just planted it in a place where I thought it would function, you know, in the book. So there's a whole lot of, I have to say this, there's probably some stuff that comes close to being realistic that I'm hiding behind facades, I suppose. Yeah. Also, a lot of it, there's in all of my books, the satellite market still exists in downtown Orange. I don't know if anybody remembers Old Town, but there used to be a real live grocery store there. Heaven help us, you could actually go down and buy food and that disappeared. But I put it in every story because I think it's unfair that it's not there now. So, you know, that's kind of a political statement on my part. Yeah.
My question was, where do you get your inspiration for your characters, and how do you develop them?
I'll start at the end. What I don't do, because I've never found that this works out, is to do like 3x5 cards with character traits on them and things like that. I simply put the characters together in my mind, and once they're embedded in my mind, I tend to know so much about them that I can only use 10% of it in the book, if that makes sense. But I think that when I get started, I already know what they would order if they walked into a bar and sat down, or whatever it might happen to be. My books are more often inspired by setting than they are by characters, and they're never inspired by concepts. And I have to say that I know writers who come up with a concept and then build a plot to express some idea that they have, and that's great. If that's the way you write, it's just not the way I write. I find that if I try to do that, the tail ends up wagging the dog every time. That you're battling to make this abstraction convincing, when in fact what you ought to be doing is making your characters' activities convincing. And I think Vladimir Nabokov famously said that that theme in literature, which of course we all chase after when we're taking lit classes at the university, he said that theme is always cliche. It's the least important thing in your book. And that struck me as being interesting the first time I read it. And also C.S. Lewis said, don't worry too much about a moral or a theme. He said, if you have one, it will appear in the book. You can't do anything about it because it's part of the whole cast of your mind and not a prefabricated thing. And those are just absolutely true for me in my book, but in my books, I should say. They're not true for everybody. Every writer I talk to has different ways of figuring out or being inspired, whatever it might happen to be. But setting does it more often than anything else, I think. And then I might ask myself, what kind of people inhabit this world, the world of your novel?
Yes, you mentioned setting as very crucial in starting off your stories. I wonder, what's the relationship between the setting of your stories and the plot line? How do you evolve the plot line?
I generally take a year, maybe 6 months in some novels, but a year. Heaven help me, the novel I'm writing right now, I think was in development for 5 years, to come up with a plot line. And I find that if I don't know enough about the plot of the book that I'm writing, I'll get to around page 80 or page 100 and I'll hit a wall. Because it's all been inspiration up until that time, and it's just kind of scattered. And the task of pulling it all together and making it into a coherent plot then begins to seem very tedious to me. So I'd rather go through the tedium of taking months, if necessary, to figure out what my story is, what's going to work and what is not going to work, so that when I begin writing, and this is specific to the way I work, I don't know if anybody else does this, but I have to have charted out the first 15 or 18 chapters in paragraph form, complete sentences, so that I know I can get through the first 150 or 180 pages, and then kind of leave it open. This developed, by the way, because back in the old days, when the world was a much nicer place, you would sell a novel by writing an outline of, say, 8 or 10 pages, 12 pages, and you'd attach the first 2 chapters to it, and you'd send it to New York, and they would send you a check and a contract. And they'd say, now do this just like you said you were going to do it, or you're going to have to give us some money back, which is just appallingly funny because no writer in the world has any money left over by the time they get the book done. You know, that's gone from a long time ago. And so I was compelled then to at least be able to write a 10-page present tense, scene by scene outline. And I got, that worked so well for me that I still do that. But I'll have at least 15 chapters which I can close my eyes and picture in my head like a film reel running, you know? I can actually see it. I know if it's night or day. I know what the characters are doing. I know what it looks like. And then I think, then the novel at that time has become so embedded in me that I can usually write. A writer friend of mine, Tim Powers, maybe some of you read some Tim Powers novels, regularly has taken 2 or 3 years to develop his plots, which are so Byzantine that it's shocking that any human being can write that sort of thing. And, you know, but I have never been able to just sit down and start writing a novel without knowing where I was going. I think I'm guilty of writing some short stories that way. But if you end up wasting your time, you're throwing 20 pages and not 120 pages into the trash. And so it's a little bit more, doable.
When you're developing a character, do you start with sort of the expected norms of a person similarly situated and then develop the character as quirky or as you choose, or do you start with the character and just let them develop organically according to the needs of the story?
That is an excellent question. I always leave room for the character to develop organically and for the plot to develop organically. And in fact, I should have mentioned that already. If I sent a 10-page plot to an editor and said, here's the plot of my next novel, give me some money, even then, I reserved the right to change it utterly. When I had my outline, I did not have it on my desktop when I was writing. It went in the desk. I never looked at it again. Either it's going to function or it's not going to function. And the same is true of characters. Some of my characters want to be eccentric. I can think of a number of my books in which the character is just kind of nutty, especially the main characters, which may or may not have a lot to do with my own eccentricities. Sometimes it's fun to have a book in which your character can do the things that you yourself would never do because you're not insane, and then you just have to make it look plausible. And in that particular world, that's what a person would do, I'm going to guess that I can tell in advance the degree to which my characters are eccentric and maybe even the setting is eccentric, and in which, or or to the contrary, that the characters would be pretty moderately reasonable folks, you know. Depends. But leaving room to develop them organically, to my mind, is absolutely necessary. That's one of the reasons that I don't like to be inspired by concepts, I suppose, and understand in advance where the book will wind up, because then you focus on being able to wind up the book at that point, and that takes a whole lot of potential creativity right out of the, out of the book, right? In fact, I wrote a short story one time in which the the character, I was watching TV, and I always get mad at weather people on TV, and so I was complaining about it, whining about the weather, and Vicky said, "You're the only person I know who takes the weather personally." And I thought, wow, I like that. I'm going to write a story about that. It took me about 2 years before I figured out how to actually write this story. And then I wrote it, and I kept changing the ending of the story. It was growing absolutely organically. And I read it to a crop of students that I had at the Orange County High School of the Arts in the short story writing class. And one of the students, very bright, she raised her hand and she said, "I thought you were going to kill your character's wife at the end of this." She said, "Do you realize that it would work perfectly well if you had killed her at the end, had her struck by lightning?" And I said, "Yeah, I can see that, And I thought how happy I was that I left room for the characters to develop, so that I didn't think there's a slam bang ending and write that story, which I have to say would be a flashy ending in many ways, but would trivialize the entire story. But I only because I was treating everything kind of organically that I didn't get locked into making that mistake. So, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
So further to that answer, we all want to put a twist that really works at the end of the story. Do you ever have that concept ahead of time, or do you just let your characters organically develop and it comes about on the last day of your writing or the last month of your writing?
If I understand the question, probably most of the things that surprise me about the writing occur in the last month of the writing. Yeah. I'm afraid that if I came up with even the coolest twist in the world, it would look like I was trying to shoehorn it into the story because it was such a groovy twist, And I know a lot of mystery stories work because of cool, reversals of expectation, and every once in a while I use them, and as the book develops. But ideally, they come naturally out of my characters misunderstanding something or whatever it might happen to be, and not simply, yeah. And I try not to get cheap, I guess. One of the things that's interesting about writing a novel, and if you've written novels, you've had this happen, you get to a point in the story where you might have 350 pages finished. I'm just throwing that out as a number. And it turns out that if you change something up, absolutely where you have to go into the book backwards to find all of the places that have to be changed in order to set that up plausibly. And I never have any problem figuring out whether it was in the middle of chapter 6 or in chapter 13 or whatever it might happen to be. I find that that by the time I'm that embedded in the story, I know absolutely every single little thing that's in that manuscript, which is kind of a surprise because you have to do a lot of work before you get to that point. One of the things I had to learn too is that chapter number 2 does not just follow chapter number 1. Chapter number 2 is a result of chapter number 1. And number 3 is a result of 1 and 2 combined. And the same for 4, 5, and 6, all the way through. So every alteration that you put in has consequences because of what you've already said. And if that's not true, then you might want to wonder, as I do, whether or not my book was merely episodic, whether everything is actually functioning in the book, or whether there are random elements in the book that that will diminish the quality of the book overall. And yet, I find myself, as I said, in later chapters, being surprised by things that the character decides to do, which is a lunatic thing to say because the writer's always in control of the character. It's never the other way around. But it seems like it is sometimes. And then you have to stop and say, ooh, was that a good one or not? Because if it's not, then you just cut it out wholesale and throw it out and, get your character about his or her business. Great. Maybe that's it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for you're just a wonderful raconteur, and it's always so insightful to hear about a writer's creative process. So we learned a lot from you, and we really appreciate you
Thank you.
sharing your wisdom with us. So thank you so much for being a great audience.
Thanks.